I think our numbers have settled, so I'll welcome all of you to our inaugural webinar, hopefully soon to be a seminar in person, on the Feast of Saint Augustine as celebrated on the Eastern Orthodox calendar, which is today, June 15th. Saint Augustine, as all of you should know, is the patron saint of this city of Saint Augustine, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the United States. It's here that the St. Photios Greek Orthodox National Shrine is located, and I'm blessed to be its hierarchical praestamino. Along with my brother in Christ, Bishop Felipe de Jesus Esteves, who's the Roman Catholic Ordinary of the Diocese of Saint Augustine. Together, we embarked on this journey when I first came here in October, that we could do something together ecumenically to mark this great man and this great feast of Saint Augustine. Fortunately for us, the Feast of Saint Augustine is celebrated on two different dates, in the Eastern calendar and in the Western calendar. But I'm sure our presenter and speaker, Dr. George Demacopoulos, will explain that to us in a little bit. But before I introduce the professor, I'd like to ask His Excellency Bishop Esteves to say a few words of welcome as well. And then we'll begin with a short prayer and I'll introduce our speaker.
I am very happy that Bishop Demetrius, my brother in St. Augustine, my brother Bishop, had this great initiative of having the celebration of today's, which is the Feast of St. Augustine in his faith tradition, as I intend to invite Bishop Demetrius and his community to our August 28, when we celebrate the feast in our calendar. So this is a gesture of fraternity and collaboration, which is at the heart of Bishop Demetrius and also in my heart.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Why don't we begin with a short prayer, which I've chosen from the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which we celebrated this morning at the shrine in honor of St. Augustine. And it's the prayer which is recited by the priest or bishop before the reading of the gospel, which I thought would be an appropriate prayer before we are illumined by our speaker this evening. Let us pray. Illumine our hearts, O Master, who loves humankind, with the pure light of your divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to the understanding of your gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of your blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things well-pleasing unto you. For you are the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and unto you we ascribe glory, together with your unoriginate Father, your all-holy, good, and life-giving Spirit, now and forever, and unto the ages of all ages. Amen. Thank you. And so now I'd like to introduce to you our speaker for this evening, Dr. George Demacopoulos. Dr. George Demacopoulos received a Master of Theological Studies with highest honors at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in 1995, before enrolling in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he earned his PhD in Religious Studies in 2002. Today, Dr. Demacopoulos is the Father John Meinendorf and Patterson Family Chair of Orthodox Christian Studies at Fordham University. Dr. Demacopoulos' research and teaching interests are in the fields of early Christian and medieval church history. He specializes in the relationship between Orthodox and Roman Catholics during the Middle Ages. He has published 9 books and dozens of scholarly articles that focus on a range of topics, including monasticism, the papacy, the Crusades, and the construction of modern Orthodox identity. Along with Dr. Aristotle Papanikolaou, Dr. Demacopoulos co-founded the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University, which is the only research university-based center of Orthodox studies in the United States. The center offers an interdisciplinary minor in Orthodox Christian Studies and a host of research-related initiatives that are bringing the insights of the history, thought, and culture of Orthodox Christianity into a broader academic conversation. In 2010, Dr. Demacopoulos was named an Archon of the Ecumenical Patriarchate with the title Didaskalos Touienos, Teacher of the Nations, and now serves as a historian for the Order of Saint Andrew the Apostle. Also, I'm fortunate I have a copy here. Dr. Demacopoulos and Tali Papanikolaou actually edited a book on Orthodox readings of Augustine, which you can certainly purchase online. I'm sure we can get you a copy if need be, and I'm sure he'd be happy to autograph it. Without further ado, I'd like to present my friend and our presenter this evening, Dr. Demacopoulos.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real honor to be with you, even if the circumstances forcing a webinar rather than a live version remain rather tragic for our country and for the world. I'd like to thank His Grace, Bishop Demetrius, for this very kind invitation. I've known His Grace for many years, and I'm always inspired by his commitment to ecumenical initiatives such as this one. I would also like to thank His Excellency, Bishop Esteves, for his participation and support. It's really quite an honor. I should note from the outset that the work I'll be presenting this evening was part of a collaborative research project that I undertook with my colleague, Aristotle Papanikolaou, whom His Grace mentioned just a moment ago. He deserves as much credit for the findings I'm about to share as I do. It's always a good idea to let an audience know what to expect, and to that end, I'll note that I've prepared a talk that should run a little less than 30 minutes. And we'll take questions at the end. For you, those of you for whom this is all rather new, there's a little Q&A box at the bottom of your webinar block, and you can type in a question there, and His Grace will select questions, and we'll have a dialogue when my prepared remarks are over. For the most part, my talk is a talk about the history of reception. The reception of Saint Augustine in the Orthodox Church. I'm interested both in the reception of the man and the reception of his ideas. As you'll see, those two things did not always align. As you'll also see, the history of Augustine's reception in the Orthodox world is one of significant shifts. My thesis is that these shifts parallel broader transformations in Orthodox Christian identity vis-a-vis its relationship to the Christian West. To state it simply, whenever the Orthodox have a generally positive view of the Christian West, then Saint Augustine has been affirmed as a father among the saints, even if his writings were not available in traditional Orthodox languages. But in those moments in the reception history, when certain Orthodox communities have held particularly negative attitudes of the Christian West, then Augustine has been denigrated. In some of the most extreme cases, he has been viewed as the source of all Western heresies. But not everything in recent history is so negative. It is precisely through this kind of historical awareness and ecumenical commitment as tonight's event that we are able to move beyond polemical caricature and embrace the sanctity and theological genius of a man like Saint Augustine. So let's begin. It remains one of the most surprising facts of Christian history that Saint Augustine became so influential for each of the Western theological traditions, and yet remained almost completely unread in the Christian East until the modern era. Despite the enormous size of his literary corpus, and despite his extraordinary importance for Latin theologians in the Middle Ages, none of Augustine's writing, apart from sentence-long quips, was translated into Greek prior to the 13th century, more than 800 years after his death. This is not to say that St. Augustine was unknown in the East. He was known, but mostly by reputation. For example, near the end of his life, the Emperor Theodosius invited Augustine to attend the Third Ecumenical Council. St. Augustine died the same year and was unable to attend. You might recall that this council included a condemnation of the errors attributed to Pelagius. This condemnation was due almost entirely to St. Augustine's influence. In the centuries that followed, there were pockets within the Byzantine Church that remained vaguely aware of the theological contributions of St. Augustine, even if they did not have access to his writing. For example, the Acts of the Fifth Ecumenical Council acknowledged St. Augustine in three different ways. They listed him among the Holy Fathers and Doctors of the Church. They included a couple short snippets of his writings, a sentence here, a sentence there. And they inform us that some of his letters were read publicly in Latin during the deliberations of the fifth session of the council. Subsequent Eastern councils similarly acknowledged the authority of St. Augustine, and in at least one case, cited a short passage from his commentary on the Gospel of John. There may be no better example of the Byzantine Church's high regard for St. Augustine than St. Photius's defense of him in the midst of the Filioque controversy in the 9th century. For our purposes, what is significant about this is the way that St. Photius dealt with the possibility that someone of St. Augustine's stature was being used in defense of the Filioque, a teaching that Photius categorically rejected. Because he did not have access to the Latin texts of the fathers who supposedly defended the Filioque, St. Photius relied upon alternative methods when he addressed the fact that the Franks claimed to ground their teaching of the Filioque in the writing of Saints Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine. For example, Photius proposed that the possibility that the original text of these saints might have been changed. He also suggested that more pressing reasons, now unknown, had required these fathers, these Latin fathers, to temporarily resort to an exaggeration of Orthodox teaching in order to prevent some other more dangerous alternative. Another of his strategies, however, might be the most compelling for us today. Photius argued that if St. Augustine taught something only slightly divergent from the rule of faith as it was now understood, without any malicious intent or without the foreknowledge of a subsequent error, he should not be held accountable for later provocateurs of trouble who would use his teaching illegitimately to promote their own error. In this context, Photius further insisted that the conscientious Christian is the one who hides the flaws of their fathers, like the sons of Noah who covered their father's nakedness, rather than expose them for their own purposes. To my mind, what is so fascinating about all of this is that St. Photius was willing to go to great length to defend the sanctity of St. Augustine, even though he appears to have never read anything by him, and even though he appears to have promoted a teaching that Photius himself categorically rejected. This likely indicates two things. First, it indicates that St. Photius knew the importance of St. Augustine to the Latin Church. And second, it tells us that he felt that it was essential to retain St. Augustine among the canon of Orthodox fathers. In short, Photius's defense of Augustine suggests that he remained well respected, if rarely read, in 9th century Byzantium. As a side note, I think it is worth observing that it is in fact the St. Photius National Shrine, which is located in St. Augustine, Florida. I think this is just absolutely perfect, given this, this little bit of history of the relationship between the two. The first translation of one of St. Augustine's texts into Greek appeared in the late 13th century, more than 800 years after his death. The translation of De Trinitate, or On the Trinity, was conducted by Maximus Planudes, and the text was subsequently read and employed by some of the most prominent members of the Byzantine Church, including Saints Gregory Palamas, and Mark of Ephesus. The example of Mark of Ephesus is particularly noteworthy because he was the 15th century theologian who famously rejected the Orthodox Catholic reunion at the Council of Florence. That Mark openly accepted the sanctity of Saint Augustine and, like Saint Photios, deflected the possibility of his teachings could be used to endorse subsequent Western errors is further evidence that Augustine, the individual, remained an authority for leading members of the Eastern Church until the end of the Byzantine Empire. Following the conquest of Byzantium by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the Christian East suffered a prolonged economic and intellectual decline. During this period, three distinct forces combined to inject a new level of Western Christian influence into the vacuum. The first was the Ottoman government's promotion of the Eastern Rite Catholic Church, a measure by the Ottomans designed to spread division among the Christian subjects of the empire. The second was the government's restrictions placed upon Orthodox printing presses. These restrictions led to the establishment of Orthodox printing presses in the West, especially in Venice, where the majority of the Orthodox ecclesial books were printed for the first time. This is all occurring at the same time as the development of the printing press. The third was the closing of nearly all Orthodox schools within the Ottoman zone, resulting in a migration of young Orthodox men to the Catholic seminaries in the West. Not surprisingly, the resulting interaction between Orthodox and Catholic students in these Western theological schools produced a variety of results, ranging from peaceful coexistence and shared learning to open hostility. And they led to fiercely ambivalent reactions about the West among those Orthodox communities which remained under Ottoman control. For our purposes, it is worth noting that during this period, the Byzantine translations of Augustine's works continued to circulate, especially on Mount Athos, the last bastion of Orthodox identity and culture within the Ottoman territory. Saint Nicodemus the Hagiorite, an Athonite monk and prolific author, whose ambivalence toward the West well characterized the attitude of many within the Greek church of this time. For this reason, it is all the more important to see the extent to which Saint Nicodemus embraced Augustine as a saint. For example, Nicodemus edited and published the Greek translation of Augustine's soliloquies. Perhaps more significantly, he included Augustine's name among the saints to be commemorated on June 15th, when he completed his monumental revision of the Synaxarion, a calendar of saints' feast days. To my knowledge, this is the first time with Saint Nicodemus that Augustine was actually introduced into the Synaxarion. I have to say that I do not know why he chose June 15th. We don't have a record of that. Following Saint Nicodemus's lead, the Russian church added Saint Augustine to their own Synaxarion a few decades later. These Synaxaria, both the Greek and the Russian, remain in use today, and it is why the Orthodox Church celebrates the Feast of Saint Augustine today, on June 15th. So this might be a good time to take a quick break and tell a theological joke. Some of you might be wondering why I keep referring to the saint as Saint Augustine, even though everyone knows that the city is Saint Augustine. When I was in college, I referred to Saint Augustine as Saint Augustine when I answered a professor's question. He stopped, looked at me, and said, "Son, Saint Augustine is in heaven. Saint Augustine is in Florida." So there you go. All right. Turning now to Russia. It's important to put the treatment of Augustine into a larger historical framework that begins with the efforts of two famous czars, Peter the Great, 17th century figure, and Catherine the Great, an 18th century figure, who both sought to modernize Russia. One important aspect of their program was the creation of an educational system that included the foundation of the first unified seminary system in the Orthodox world. Because Peter and Catherine saw the seminary program as a means to further their pro-Western agenda, these schools adopted a decidedly Western curriculum, which replaced traditional Orthodox readings and saints' lives with scholastic and Enlightenment authors. While it would be impossible to quantify the impact of these educational reforms for subsequent Russian theology, it is certain that the push for Westernization by Peter and Catherine fueled the 19th century's reactionary movement against the West and especially against the Roman Catholic Church in Russia. Indeed, the reaction against Peter and Catherine's reforms ultimately led to a revival of interest in the ascetic and patristic sources of the Orthodox Church. The more extreme version of this anti-Westernization in Russia was something known as the Slavophile movement, which interpreted the Christian West as fundamentally incompatible with the Christian East. It was in this context that St. Augustine, for the first time in the history of the Orthodox Church, was categorically condemned as the one who initiated Western Christianity's slide into heresy. Although the Slavophile critique was not pervasive in Russian intellectual circles, it did anticipate what would become the three central theological critiques for Orthodox readers of Augustine in the 20th century: his theological epistemology, his view of the relationship between sin and grace, and his Trinitarian theology. Despite the significance of the Slavophile movement, it must be stressed that the more pervasive Russian intellectual response to Augustine was what we might call a genuine critical engagement, which included a translation of his entire corpus into Russian between 1879 and 1895. One of the most sustained theological engagements with St. Augustine among Russian authors in this time occurred in the work of Sergius Bulgakov. Bulgakov focused on two theological themes: Augustine's teaching on sin and grace and his Trinitarian theology. With respect to the latter, Bulgakov introduced the juxtaposition that Augustine's Trinitarian theology begins with the divine essence and then moves into the three persons. In contrast, according to Bulgakov, to the Cappadocian Fathers, who begin with the Trinity of persons and then move to the common essence. This distinction, or this opposite way of looking at things between Augustine and the Cappadocians that Bulgakov introduced became the kind of foundational commonplace for all scholars of Trinitarian theology in the 20th century, regardless of what theological background you come from. This is the way the Orthodox teach it, this is the way the Catholics teach it, this is the way Protestants teach it, and so forth, at least during the 20th century. But what is even more noteworthy is the implication of Bulgakov's analysis of Augustine's view on the Trinity, because he believed that Augustine offered a more adequate account of the unity of the Trinity than anything found in the Cappadocian Fathers. This is really shocking for such an influential Orthodox theologian to make this point. With respect to St. Augustine's teaching on sin and grace, Bulgakov followed other contemporary Orthodox theologians in rejecting Augustine's teaching because they believed that Augustine's notion of original sin corrupted human nature to the point of denying free will. Following the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Orthodox theologians in diaspora gave birth to the most important Orthodox movement of the 20th century, known as the Neo-patristic synthesis. Two of the founding members of this movement, Fathers George Florovsky and Vladimir Lossky, emphasized the theological distinction between God's essence and his energy, a distinction that had first been articulated by Gregory Palamas in the 14th century. Though he was far from being a Slavophile, Lossky echoed their understanding of the causes of division within Christianity in terms of a Western rationalization of theology versus an Eastern emphasis on a knowledge of God as mystical experience. For Lossky, the culprit of this rationalization of theology was not so much Augustine as it was Thomas Aquinas, and more specifically, the 20th century interpreters of Aquinas, known as the Neo-scholastics. According to Lossky, the failure of Neo-scholasticism was its misinterpretation of apophatic theology, which would lead to what he believed to be the Catholic rejection of Gregory Palamas's essence-energy distinction and the understanding of grace as created. The Neo-patristic school would exercise a decisive influence on Orthodox theology in the 20th century through a group of young theologians in Greece in the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s. This new generation of Greek theologians wanted to break with their professors, whom they perceived as simply imitating the theological manuals of the West. This theological imitation is not surprising, and perhaps even understandable, given the fact that Greece suffered more than 400 years under Ottoman oppression. The post-colonial situation in Greece was such that given the decimation of a once vibrant intellectual tradition that reached back into the Byzantine period, in the rush to re-establish institutions of higher learning, theological education in Greece would rely on the forms of Christian thinking dominant in the non-Orthodox Christian world, especially those forms of thinking that were most consistent with the general outlines of Orthodox belief, obviously Roman Catholicism being first among them. But for many of these young Greek theologians in the 1950s and 60s, the shedding of one colonizer from the Muslim East had only allowed for the surreptitious colonization of the intellectual life in Greece by the Christian West. The return to the Fathers was an attempt to liberate theology from all colonization. Given this context, most Greek theologians of this new generation interpreted the West as diametrically opposed to the East, both theologically and in terms of its cultural ethos. One of the most vociferous spokespersons for this dichotomous juxtaposition between West and East was Father John Romanides. It is generally agreed that Romanides was the first and most important, in a series of Orthodox writers who unapologetically condemned Augustine. Romanides not only unequivocally faulted Augustine for the theological mistakes of Western Christianity, but also attributed to him a mode of thinking that would serve as the foundation for a cultural ethos in the West that would be diametrically opposed to that embodied in Christian antiquity and the Byzantine Empire. What Romanides refers to as the Romeocene. Romanides was a student at St. Sergius, where he no doubt came into contact with the work of Losky and Florovsky, who taught there. Like Losky, Romanides argued that the West's key theological error was the rejection of the essence-energies distinction, which to his mind was also a rejection of theosis, since the essence-energies distinction is necessary for conceptualizing theosis. Romanides essentially extends Losky's critique of scholasticism back to Augustine, to whom he attributes its foundations. Although Florovsky had also admitted that Augustine rejected the essence-energy distinction, Romanides went far beyond Florovsky by labeling Augustine's thought as the source for all subsequent Western theological error. One could say that for Romanides, the theological schism begins with St. Augustine, and he would not agree with Florovsky's reference to Augustine as a universal father of the church. Romanides inaugurated a movement in some Greek theological circles to expunge the well-established Roman Catholic and Protestant academic perspectives that prevailed in the Greek universities of his day. One can read much of Romanides' historical work as a post-colonial search for an authentic Orthodox identity in the midst of what he took to be a poisonous Western influence in the theological academies of the Christian East. Romanides was, of course, not the only Orthodox writer of the 20th century to point to Augustine as the cause for most of what went wrong with the West in the Middle Ages. But it was his work that first articulated and likely informed the sentiments espoused by later Greek authors, including Christos Ioannidis and Metropolitan John Zizoulas. Ioannidis would agree with Romanides that Augustine's rejection of the essence-energies distinction was the beginning of the emergence of a distinct Western theological and cultural ethos. But he would amplify this claim by arguing that the sources of the absence of this distinction lie in Augustine's rejection of apophaticism. The problems of the West do not begin with the misinterpretation of Dionysius, as Losky had claimed, of the scholastics, but with Augustine's rejection of apophaticism. Augustine predates Dionysius. Elsewhere, Ioannidis adds, quote, Augustine's theology was decisive, offering an ideal basis for a differentiated Christian version of Let me repeat that. Augustine's theology was decisive, offering an ideal basis for a differentiated Western version of Christianity. For Ioannidis, the logic of divine human communion, theosis, demands an apophatic method in theology, in the sense that it asserts the incomprehensibility of the divine essence. But this incomprehensibility implies that knowledge of God lies beyond reason, in an ecstatic movement of participation in the divine energies. Like Romanides, Ioannidis argues that Augustine instituted a way of thinking that would define a Western cultural ethos that is diametrically opposed to that formed within the Byzantine East. Theologically, one could summarize the critique of both Romanides and Ioannidis of Augustine in one word: distance. What both see occurring in Augustine is the foundation for a theological method that would ultimately deny theosis, the realism of divine human communion, and reinforce a distance between the God-world relation in terms of propositional understanding of theological knowledge, an understanding of grace as created, and hence a legalistic understanding of salvation. The problem, at least to my mind, and scholars more recently, is that Romanides and Ioannidis were judging Augustine anachronistically through a hesychastic framework that was only developed 1,000 years after Augustine's death. In a sense, they were themselves injecting neo-scholastic manual understandings of theological epistemology and salvation, albeit in their own filtered, imitative Greek form. What began in the 19th century as a general rejection of the Augustinian understanding of sin and grace developed into a more sweeping condemnation of Augustine's theological method. In fact, his understanding of sin and grace is eventually attributed to his approach to theology. The common thread in the contemporary Orthodox critique of Augustine is the perception that Augustine prioritizes philosophy over theology. This particular critique, however, only began to take shape in the generation of Greek theologians in the 1960s. For them, the foundation for a Western Christian understanding of the God-world relation is legalistic and thus ultimately nominalistic. And as a consequence, it makes possible an Anselmian atonement theory of salvation rather than the Eastern patristic notion of deification. It is illuminating that the unequivocal condemnation of Augustine by Orthodox theologians first appears in the early 19th century Russia in its Slavophile form, and then reappears in the late 1950s among Greek theologians. In both situations, the anti-Augustine sentiment emerges together with a reaction against what is perceived to be Western influences that are incompatible with the intellectual and spiritual traditions then in vogue in Russia and Greece. The move toward a restoration of a more authentic, national, intellectual, and spiritual identity in these Orthodox countries was based on a construction of a particular set of categories, namely the West and the East, and an understanding of these categories in terms of diametrical opposition. Anything falling on one side of the divide was judged as opposed to the other. Augustine, one could say, for these theologians, simply lived on the wrong side of the tracks. In sum, 20th century Orthodox responses to Augustine, coupled with an anachronistic emphasis on the essence-energy distinction as a hermeneutical key for interpreting East-West dichotomy, has as much to do with Orthodox identity formation vis-a-vis the West as it does with any genuine theological difference between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. And it is only after we come to understand the context in which these acrimonious statements were produced that we can gain a greater appreciation for the real theological genius and contributions of a saint as great as Saint Augustine. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Quite compelling, and our questions reflect that. And excited to get to them because they come from literally all over the world.
Great.
Yes, I'm very excited about it. The one comment we received was fascinating from Stephen Morris and Elliot Kreloff. But I want to begin with the question from Mark K., who asks, Augustine and Chrysostom were contemporaries in time and seem to represent the two poles of thought, West and East, within Christianity. First, do we have any evidence of interaction between the two? Second, do you see any overlap in their teaching and thought that could harmonize East and West? Whoop.
Yeah.
Especially on some of Augustine's more controversial teachings, original sin, predestination, free will.
Okay, so thank you. This is a great question. I think there are actually maybe 7 questions embedded within it. Yeah, so let me try to address it. So first of all, what I would really like to resist is this notion of polarity, that Chrysostom is on one end of the spectrum and Augustine is on the other. In many ways, they're far more complementary than anything else. They believe the same. They believe the same creed. They're common, or they're what they have in common is that they are so famous within their own traditions. And what they also have in common is that the vast majority of their literary output is commentaries on scripture. And when we read the actual commentaries on scripture, rather than delving into the polemical works of Saint Augustine or the letters, but when we just focus on the commentaries on scripture and on his hundreds and hundreds of sermons that survive, you will find that Saint Augustine and Saint Chrysostom look far more alike than you might otherwise imagine. So if you could imagine Saint Augustine is the bishop actually of a very small place, Hippo, right? It's a very small town. He preached constantly in front of a small community of Christians, and his daily interactions with people were primarily pastoral and exegetical. We know of Augustine because his literary output is absolutely enormous. It's larger than any other Christian from antiquity. It's so large that the whole of pagan Roman literature, Cicero, Seneca, Ovid, all of that combined is less than the surviving corpus of Augustine.
Wow.
Right? So that gives you a sense of how much Augustine there is out there. But the vast majority of that material is pastoral, it's preaching, it's so forth. And when you compare that to all of the scriptural commentaries of Chrysostom which survive, which is principally what we have of Chrysostom, they really do look a lot more alike than we realize. Their methods for exegesis are largely similar. I mean, you'll hear it often misstated that St. Chrysostom reads scripture literally or like a literalist. That's actually not true. Sometimes you'll hear it said that he reads it historically. That's actually not true. If you read any commentary of Chrysostom, 3/4 of the commentary is a moral analysis of the scriptural text. He explains what's going on in the scriptural text historically, and then he goes off on that to give a moral analogy or to talk about how we apply that how we would apply that in our moral lives. St. Augustine does something very similar in his own preaching. Another question embedded was, is there any evidence for interaction or knowledge between the two? Not that I know of. I simply don't. I don't know of any. Now Chrysostom died only shortly after Augustine became a bishop, so there would not have been that much opportunity for interaction. We don't, to my knowledge, I don't know of any evidence that Augustine has access to anything that Chrysostom wrote. He did, however, have access to some of the writings of the Cappadocians, and he didn't use it.
They keep coming, and I'd like to go a little far away. They're wonderful questions, and we're trying to get to all of them. This is from Brazil.
Wonderful.
Person named Graham. Hello from Brazil. Now, I hope I get the names correct. Sarah Coakley challenges Bulgakov's East-West division on Trinity versus Cappadocian Fathers in her systematic theology. Is she right? Or is Bulgakov, among with the way many systematic theologies continue to approach the question East-West, Orthodox versus Roman Catholic / Protestant, correct to highlight the difference?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I have to confess I'm really more of a historian than a theologian. What Bulgakov, so you have to remember that Bulgakov basically found stuff in Augustine that he was fascinated by, and he was trying to share it with Orthodox readers. And he said, we Orthodox were so accustomed to thinking about the Trinity in the way that the Cappadocians taught it to us. But Augustine is coming at it from a different angle. And let me now share with you what it has to offer. Now, Bulgakov introduces that, and then it just becomes a kind of trope that everybody's going to teach after Bulgakov, right? And whereas Bulgakov used it as a way to bring East and West together by trying to convince Orthodox to read Augustine because he had something creative and new to their minds for how to appreciate the complexity of the Trinity. When that distinction then began to be taught, it was taught in a way that made Augustine and the Cappadocians seem much further apart than Bulgakov had ever intended. So the question is Dr. Coakley correct that Bulgakov's distinction is wrong? On the one hand, yes, and on the one hand, no. On the one hand, yes, she's certainly correct to push against the way it has been taught over the last 75 years, because it's being taught as polarity, that the Cappadocians and Augustine understand the Trinity in a kind of polar way. She's absolutely right to resist that. But I think what happens is that we don't really fully appreciate the ecumenical way that Bulgakov was trying to engage Augustine.
Excellent. Thank you. I think we should continue. This is good. I have Dr. John Photios. We might know.
I'm going to get a hard question from my good friend.
Not really. It's actually quite compelling, and I think it's a good one for now. What could you tell an Orthodox Christian who knows very little about Augustine to help them appreciate why should they respect Augustine as a saint and as a great Orthodox theologian?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Augustine wrote a book called The Confessions.
Yes.
And he wrote it, if memory serves, he wrote it about 20 years after it sort of takes place. So the narrative arc of the book is it's kind of like it's a spiritual travelogue. And it chronicles his life from his youth through his conversion in Milan. And it talks about him moving from one religious tradition to another. His mother had been a Christian, but Augustine, he had a brilliant philosophical mind, and to him, Christianity didn't make any philosophical sense. It was too simplistic. It was not for smart people. Mm. And it was only after he was introduced to allegorical reading through St. Ambrose that the scriptures kind of came alive for him, and he was able to see the genius, the philosophical genius within Christianity. So this book, The Confessions, it chronicles this, but it does so much more than just chronicle this. it really is one of the most honest and penetrating examinations of self that I have ever read or ever seen. He tells these stories of his youth when he is doing things that he knew to be wrong at the time. Like, he genuinely knew it, but he did it anyway, and he never really knew what to do, right? And there's a point in the Confessions, I give this Lenten lecture all the time by this title. There's a point in the Confessions when Augustine has come to embrace the theological truism of Christianity, but he hasn't come to embrace the moral requirements of Christianity. He has a mistress. He enjoys having his mistress. He doesn't want to marry her. He doesn't want to give up sex. And so he's literally praying aloud, Lord, convert me, but not yet.
Yes, I remember that.
Right? It is one of the most honest, right, statements of a penitent Christian that you'll ever hear. Right. And so if someone wants to know where to start with Augustine, start with the Confessions. I mean, you will find yourself, whoever you are, you will find yourself in this book, following him along in his quest to God. It's really spectacular.
I would agree. And then I would not start with City of God, that's for sure.
No. Or De Trinitate. My head hurts every time I try to read De Trinitate.
Well, following up on that, about making him chaste, but not yet, as he said. Very interesting talk. I'm sorry, where did that go? I'm new at this, people. John Griminus, I think that's how you pronounce it. What is there of Augustine that the Eastern Orthodox Church believes would grant him the elevation to sainthood in the Eastern Church?
Well,
I think you answered it in a roundabout way about confession, but there's more.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's lots of things. First of all, there are canons and acts of ecumenical councils that refer to him as a saint. Right. Mm-hmm. So that in and of itself provides testimony that the Eastern Church has always regarded Augustine as a saint. As I mentioned, Saint Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain introduced him to the Synaxarion, and the Russians actually did a series of hymns for his feast day. To my mind, well, on the one hand, there's the theological genius that plays itself out in something like De Trinitate or the City of God. There is also his absolute defense of Orthodox teaching against a variety of heresies, Donatism, Manichaeanism, Pelagianism, and so forth, and his work to bring unity to the church in all of those contexts. So for all of those reasons, Augustine is a saint of the Orthodox Church.
Okay. I think the next one is more of a statement and a reflection by a person named David Fisher. Thank you, Dr. Demacopoulos. My name is Father David Fisher, and I'm a Maronite Catholic priest, and I'm a professor of Eastern Christian thought at St. Charles Seminary in Philadelphia. Could we not see St. Augustine as representing not so much an Eastern-Western theological dialogue or at times divide, but as a North African Christian, Eastern Christian dialogue or at times divide, given the unique theological environment of North Africa with Cyprian, Tertullian, Donatism, Pelagianism, etc.?
Yeah, so this is a great observation. So I have to confess that this is one of those areas that I know scholars do a lot of work with. I myself really kind of only know it exists, and I know it from the periphery, right? So the fact of the matter is that Augustine comes from a Roman family that had been part of the kind of colonial project of North Africa for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. So he's you know, there is no kind of nationality in the ancient world, but ethnically he's Roman, you know, Italian, Roman, so forth, living in North Africa. But he grows up in a theological tradition that is somewhat mixed with respect to its subservience to the Church of Rome. The majority of North African Christians, primarily in Carthage, which is close to Hippo, Carthage, modern day Tunisia. There is a great theological tradition, as Father mentioned, with Tertullian and Cyprian and so forth. And at times, those leaders in North Africa are subservient to Rome and take their cue from Rome, or contribute to what's going on in Rome, in the church in Rome. And at other times, they completely go their own way. And so it is very much the case that, at least through the life of Augustine, the North African church does have its own distinctive voice, in the same way that the Church of Gaul will have its own distinctive voice in the 6th century. Certainly the way that Alexandria in Egypt has a distinctive voice, Antioch has a distinctive voice, and so forth. And so at the time of Augustine's life, or Chrysostom's life, it is absolutely the case that Augustine does not represent the West. Augustine speaks for, or speaks with, speaks to, and represents North African Christianity. That's absolutely categorically true, although he is thinking in Latin rather than Greek or Syriac or Coptic. So that does put him in somewhat philosophical, theological affinity with the likes of Jerome, Ambrose, Gregory the Great, and so forth. But what will happen, and the reason Augustine becomes an East-West issue, is because there is no other figure in the Western Christian tradition that has anywhere near the influence that Augustine has, right? In the Eastern Church, it's more muted. You have the 3 Cappadocians for theology and asceticism. You have Chrysostom for homiletics and exegesis. You have Maximus for high theology, right? You have this plurality of voices. In the West, Augustine really does dominate. And so Augustine, with time, comes to represent or be a stand-in for the whole of the Western Christianity, even if that is not at all the case at the time he's alive.
Which would bring me now to Father David Einen's question. Can we expound? Why does it do that? Can we expound Pelagianism, since its rejection seems to be a place which both St. Augustine and other Orthodox saints agree?
Yeah, so Pelagius basically taught that Pelagius was a monk, and he pretty much taught that a person could, through hard work and determination, spiritual hard work, determination, asceticism, and so forth, that a person could basically earn their way to salvation, right? That the scriptures were full of instructions for us to follow, and that a monk who worked hard enough could, or anyone who worked hard enough could kind of earn their way to salvation. Augustine rejected this by saying that we cannot on our own earn our way to salvation, that we need God's grace, and that without God's grace, we're kind of lost. Now, the debate literally goes on for about 15 years, and Pelagius kind of goes away, but then he has supporters who come after him, and one guy in particular, Julian of Eclanum, is a pretty smart guy, and he starts pushing Augustine and pushing Augustine and pushing Augustine. I'm not going to, give a whole seminar on this now, but basically what happens is Augustine, as I was tweeting out today for the Feast of Saint Augustine, Augustine, at least to my mind, backs himself into an intellectual corner.
Mm-hmm.
near the end of his life. And it is in this context in which he develops the doctrine of original sin. And it's in this context, well, it doesn't develop, he invents the doctrine of original sin, and he invents the doctrine of predestination as ways to explain why we can't merit our own salvation, why we need God's grace. So I'm not going to go into all the details. I will simply lift it up to say that the questioner is absolutely right that both the Orthodox and the Catholics side with Augustine in their critique of Pelagius and Julian of Ephrata and so forth. Where there is some difference lies in the later Augustine, when he goes so all in against the Pelagians that he comes up with these teachings on original sin and predestination that do not have any cognate or any real cognate in Greek, Syriac, or Coptic theology of the time. And so if there is an area, to my mind, in which Augustine is talking about things for which there aren't Eastern Christian cognates, it is on these issues of sin and grace around original sin and so forth.
It is 8:04, but I'm willing to go to a quarter after if you are, and
Sure.
if Fordham will allow us to.
Yeah.
We have to thank Fordham University for this wonderful opportunity of hosting it with a webinar. Since you mentioned predestination, Felix Delago writes, how much influence from St. Augustine would you say that John Calvin had?
A great deal. Yeah, I mean, and this is what I mean when I say that Augustine is so influential for all Western Christian traditions, right? Lutheranism, especially Calvinism, right, are deeply indebted to Augustine's teaching on sin and grace. Absolutely.
The next two, thank you. The next two seem similar. So I'll read them both and
Sure.
see if you agree with me if they're similar. Lewis Grant, Gant, G-A-N-D-T. It seems significant that the first of Augustine's writings to be translated into Greek was De Trinitate, given that much of Trinitarian theology had been developed in the East. Can you comment on the extent to which Augustine was familiar with the Greek theologians of his time? Brent Shaw asks, if Augustine's works were not translated into Greek before the 13th century, how did churchmen in the East gain access to his works or even had any knowledge about his ideas? I presume that they did not read Latin. And the follow-up question to that is, how can they acquire a copy of your book? But that was, I think the first two sounded similar to me, but you
yes,
might.
no, they're certainly related. So I'll say just a little bit about the second question first, which is that there are snippets of Augustine, like for the scholars, and some of these questions I know are coming from scholars. There are these things called florilegia which circulate, and so they're kind of like quips, a sentence or two on a theme where you assemble a bunch of fathers on a theme and you just have a sentence, right? There are florilegia of Augustine that are circulating in the East, and they're being translated into Greek. There is nothing else translated into Greek apart from the florilegia until the 13th century. And the reason or let me put it another way, there is a very specific reason why Augustine is translated when he is and which text it is. So in the latter part of the 13th century, the Byzantine emperor Michael VII Palaeologus, or 7th, 8th, whatever it is, the one who recaptures Constantinople and ends the occupation of the Fourth Crusade. He is desperate to prevent a new crusade against Byzantium. And so he takes a very conciliatory tone toward the papacy, and he helps to orchestrate, or he attempts to orchestrate a reunion of the 1054 schism. And to help facilitate the reunion, he commissions the translation of the most famous Latin book on the Trinity, because one of the debates in the context of the 13th century is the Filioque, which is a Trinitarian debate. And all of the Catholic theologians at the time, all of the scholastics, are relying on Augustine. And nobody in the East has ever read Augustine. None of them read Latin, or very, very few of them read Latin. And so the emperor commissions this Greek translation of De Trinitate at that time in the latter part of the 13th century to facilitate union between the two churches. And then, interestingly enough, even though that reunion fails, every single Greek theologian from that point on reads and quotes Augustine. Gregory Palamas quotes Augustine, Gennadius Scholarius quotes Augustine, the Planudes brothers, of course, quote Augustine, and on and on and on.
Okay. Wonderful. Here's an interesting question. I don't know if it's so. Chris Howell. What do we make of Seraphim Rose's defense of Augustine against some neo-patristic writers? Maybe some of the streams of modern orthodoxy that one might expect to be hostile to him from an identity standpoint might be more willing to accept Augustine if his personal piety is emphasized as a positive example in Orthodox life.
Yeah, I'm glad he asks this question. Seraphim Rose, Father Seraphim Rose, to my mind, he has got to be the 20th century's greatest Orthodox enigma. So on the one hand, he is really he's really an outlier compared to other Orthodox thinkers. And we wouldn't even necessarily categorize him as a thinker. He's not a theologian. He's a monk who writes, right? He has no advanced theological training or seminary experience or anything like that. He's just somebody who goes and lives in the forests in California as a hermit. So on the one hand, he's like completely against evolution. He's all in on the toll houses, right? Mm-hmm. So some of these things that fundamentalists like circles get all wrapped up in, Seraphim Rose is your guy, right? But on the other hand, in ways you wouldn't expect whatsoever, in the midst of all of these 20th century Greek theologians condemning Augustine, he writes a book in defense of Saint Augustine. And it's absolutely fascinating. And this is why I say Seraphim Rose is such an enigma. So I'm glad he brought this up. I remember it's been more than 10 years since I've read it. I actually taught it once when I taught a course on Augustine, and I was preparing for this conference, the book that His Grace showed me for. And yeah, he was an unapologetic defender of Augustine. Now, he was himself a convert to Orthodoxy. He'd actually been a Buddhist before he was a Christian, but at least that's my memory. He was a Buddhist. But yeah, Seraphim Rose defends Augustine, and as the questioner asks, tries to get people to move past the theological debates and more to the person.
I'm going to ask you two questions that seem to follow one another.
Okay.
We've answered 11 questions, and there are still 12 questions open. And our planning that you would be willing to write the answers to some of these individuals we're asking. Was that correct?
Sure.
So, Father Michael Palamara writes, if the innocent energies distinction is not formulated and clarified for another millennium, on what basis do Father Romanidis and Yanaras criticize St. Augustine? Is his writing ever polemically against the understanding of the time as confessed by the Cappadocians and others? Are these divisive issues even important for St. Augustine? Is there a contention more based off the interpretation in the West that follows St. Augustine?
Okay, so I'm not sure I followed all of those because they're all complicated questions and very smart questions. So the first one, and that's the one that really stuck in my mind, is on what basis do Romanides and Yanaras ignore the anachronism? They just ignore it, right? Yanaras you can excuse a little more because he's a philosopher, and philosophers never want to get bogged down with historical with chronology, right? They're not going to bother. Romanides, to my mind, you can't excuse for this because Romanides' book on the subject was presented as a historical work. And it's precisely because it was presented as a kind of historical excavation that the anachronism is just glaring and deeply, deeply problematic. So the short answer to your question is they don't care that it's anachronistic. To their mind, the essence-energy distinction is theologically true because the church affirms it, even if it didn't affirm it until the 14th century, and therefore everybody is responsible for it, which is, well, it's just not very bright. It's not only not very bright, it's also not very generous, right?
The last part of Father's question, though, might be something to shed some light on. Is their contention more based off the interpretation in the West that follows St. Augustine?
So for Yanaras, I certainly think it is. Yanaras is also an interesting figure. We wrote a little bit about him in the conference that followed this one. And what's fascinating about both of them is they both did all of their theological training in the West, right? Yanaras went to school in Germany. I believe he was at school in Paris first, and then he did his PhD in Germany. Romanides, I believe, was born in the United States, did his training in Paris, did some training in Athens. And for Yanaras, he is looking for kind of civilizational divide. And so Yanaras certainly has in mind the kind of cultural ethos of the intellectual West versus what he thinks should be the cultural ethos of the intellectual East. And so to answer Father Michael's question, he is certainly thinking about Yanaras is certainly thinking about what comes later. Romanides, is he thinking about what comes later or the way that Augustine gets used? Maybe, I'm not sure. Romanides sets out to, his doctoral dissertation was called The Ancestral Sin, and he's trying to lay out what's different between the Orthodox view of what they'll call ancestral sin and the Catholic view of original sin. And to his credit, there are parts of that dissertation that are actually fabulous, right? They're really, really good. When he sticks to the history and when he sticks to the sources, he's really, really good. It's when he gets into these kind of sweeping theological polemics that where he just wants to condemn Augustine completely because according to him, original sin and these other things set in motion a fundamental Western rejection of essence energy, that he's being neither charitable nor sound as a scholar.
And let's leave from Yanaras to another modern theologian, because my good friend and your brother Archon, Nick Furis, asks, Doctor, you mentioned a contemporary theologian of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, Metropolitan John of Pergamon, or Zizulos. What does he say about St. Augustine?
Yeah, so I in the longer version of this talk that Dr. Papanikolaou and I prepared, there were several paragraphs on Zizioulas as well, and I cut them out for time's sake here. So if memory serves, Zizioulas is mostly interested in Augustine's Trinitarian theology. And Zizioulas is very much a Cappadocian. He very much believes in this notion of the monarchy of the Father and the three hypostases and so forth. And so Zizioulas does in his writing from maybe the 90s, the 80s, the 90s, something like that. Mm-hmm. He does criticize certain aspects of Augustine's Trinitarian theology. Basically because it doesn't fit the Cappadocian model. For Zizioulas, the Cappadocian model, like many Greek theologians, the Cappadocian model is the kind of principal way or the foundational way to think about the Trinity.
So Zizioulas would be more in line with Yanaras's thinking.
So yes, in the sense that he thinks that Augustine's Trinitarian theology is inadequate, but not in the sense that he thinks Augustine's Trinitarian theology or anything else leads to civilizational divide between East and West. Zizioulas is much more ecumenically inclined than Yanaras. At least I can't speak for Yanaras today. He's still with us, but at least the writing of Yanaras from decades past, he really sees an enormous gulf between East and West, and that is not the case for Zizioulas.
I'm going to bring us down to probably a more practical question, because the other ones that are here, I'm sure you can do a number of lectures on, and I hope that yeah, it does get answered. And for everyone listening, please forgive us if we didn't get to your question. It's just, there's so many and they're good. So I'm coming to a more practical question given to us by Father Milton Janulius, who writes, is the Russian period of Westernization also the time and place where we first see the introduction of what we would call in the East, the heretical icon of the Holy Trinity? That is a depiction of an old man, the sun, and then the dove. And we're all familiar with that unique icon.
Yeah. So I'm not an art historian, and so all I can do is guess, but I'm going to guess that that is true.
And I think that's a good way to bring this to because, the other ones are very compelling, and I hope you have a chance to look at them. I would like to thank all of you for your participation. And before we close our evening, His Excellency Bishop Felipe Estefes will be offering a few closing remarks and a closing prayer. And we look forward to our brothers and sisters celebration in the West on August 28th, where I'll be invited and the guests of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Saint Augustine, as opposed to Saint Augustine. Lord.
Bishop,
thank you.
I doubted that our celebration will be as erudite as this Greek version on June, but the conversation of the scholar, Dr. Demacopoulos, it reflects how interesting is the history of theology and how these two streaks, East and West, regretfully at times move in very different direction. But since Jesus Christ is the reconciler and all things are in him, it is my hope that Augustine may help us to bridge the gap of East and West. And I think that your presence in St. Augustine help us to bring that gap. And I am very thankful that you had this great idea of celebrating this day in the context of the pandemic with this magnificent lecture. We are certainly very enriched.
Thank you, Excellency. Would you give us your blessings as we close this webinar?
Yes, would you join me in the blessing? And may the Lord be praised, may the Lord be adored, may the Lord be known and loved and served in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, one and all. Thank you, Dr. Demacopoulos. Thank you, Fordham University, for your assistance. And we hope this is just the beginning of a wonderful relationship between St. Photios Greek National Shrine and, of course, the beloved diocese, Roman Catholic Diocese of Saint Augustine, and of course, continuing relationship with Dr. Demacopoulos. Dr. Aristotle Papanikolaou was with us. I noticed he was online. And thank you and good night.
Yeah, thank you.